So the stapled handout is the outline of what I'd like to cover. Lots of material there. Obviously, we can't go into detail on absolutely everything. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes and then allow for about 20 minutes of questions. And so what I will do is I'll deal with the who are they. You know, who are evangelicals? Talk a little bit about the movement itself, sort of the typical definition of evangelicalism, just identify a few key leaders, and then move to the where are they going, and look at some of the questions surrounding the issues facing Christians in general, but evangelicals in particular. And then I have a few comments about the future. And so hopefully in 40 minutes you'll get a sense of sort of where they are, where they're going, but also who they are, and we'll go from there. Evangelicalism is a movement that has quite a history, has a very rich history, has a very inspiring history. It also has areas of history that you kind of wish didn't happen, but that's like any movement in Christian history, whether it's whatever denomination you want to find, whatever movement you want to find. It has its saints and it has its sinners, and evangelicalism does as well. And so let's at least begin to look at who they are, who are evangelicals. And you've got a single sheet of paper, and I do want to draw your attention to that single sheet of paper. So if you're looking at a PowerPoint slide, there's a funny little field guide to evangelicals. If you ask those in media who evangelicals were, you will get one position, probably not very positive description of what an evangelical is. If you ask those who were part of the movement, they'll give you a different definition. If you ask Catholics, you may get a different one. If you ask Eastern Orthodox, and so on and so forth. I'd like to look at how evangelicals define themselves, but also with one eye on, of course, how others see them, and we could talk about that as well. But who are they? The other book, edited by Mark Knoll, David Bebbington, and George Marsden, is if you really want to get into sort of the nitty-gritty of evangelicalism, the book Evangelicals, Who They Have Been, Are Now, and Could Be. And so that's a book that you may want to look up if you really want to go deep into the subject, but it's there for you just to know that you've got a range of scholarship on it, from very popular to very rigorous historical theological analysis. Next slide. So I want to talk about the DNA of evangelicalism. The DNA, of course, is I'm just using this as a metaphor for what makes evangelicals, what makes them in terms of their origins, their being, their motives, their actions, their ethos, their beliefs, all those kinds of things, as a way of helping us understand who evangelicals are. Now, I identify as an evangelical, and I resonate with the movement, but those outside the movement may not really get what the movement is. And those inside the movement sometimes aren't even quite sure what the movement is in terms of formal definition or what would define the movement. And when you poll people, you get different definitions of what evangelicalism is. And those who will have very differing definitions on the movement. What I want to draw your attention to is, let's see, the next slide. What is it? Talk about what it isn't and what it is, and then we'll look at that handout on the definition. Evangelicalism is not a denomination. Baptists can be evangelical, Presbyterians can be evangelical, Methodists can be evangelical, and so on and so forth. So it's not a denomination itself. It's a movement that people in different denominations or denominations themselves identify with. And so we need to note, we're not talking about a denomination. This isn't, I spoke here on Baptist 101. Well, that's a denomination, has its organization, its structures, its official statement of faith, so on and so forth. But this is a movement, not a denomination. Traditional denominational distinctives are not critical for the movement. This isn't a movement that says believer's baptism or infant baptism or congregational government or Episcopal government or Presbyterian government, because for evangelicals, those kinds of issues aren't so critical. And that's why you'll see Baptists pairing up with Pentecostals, pairing up with Methodists, pairing up with Anglicans on mission work, because the priority for evangelicals isn't church governance, church structures, or how do we baptize people properly or not, how do we carry out the liturgy on Sunday, how do we understand sacraments. Those things are important, but they're not what define evangelicals or what defines the movement itself. Evangelicals have said, we will put those things over here recognizing we'll disagree on those, but this is what we will agree on, and we'll talk about that in a moment. It has no head or official leader. There is a head of the Catholic Church, that's the Pope. The head of various different Orthodox communities would be the Patriarch of Constantinople, the Patriarch in Russia, Ukraine, so on and so forth. You have official leaders. There is no official leader of evangelicalism. You have unofficial leaders. At one time, Billy Graham was seen to sort of be an unofficial spokesperson for evangelicals. But you'll have others, but they're usually self-appointed leaders. They see themselves as spokespersons for evangelicalism. But because it's a movement, not an organization, there is no single leader who speaks ex cathedra, out of the authority of the bishop's seat, to say this is who's in, this is who's out, this is the movement, this is not the movement. It is a reaction to something. Evangelicalism was born in the 1700s as a reaction to something, and we'll spend time looking at that. It's a movement that's concerned, deeply concerned about the state of the church in the 18th century. Deeply concerned, and thus a movement was born. And so we'll talk about that. And it is shaped by culture and national identity. And so there have been studies comparing American evangelicals to Canadian evangelicals, to British evangelicals, to Kenyan evangelicals, to Indian evangelicals, to Chinese evangelicals. And they'll say that there are similarities that transcend culture, but there are also things that are cultural, that there are different characteristics or a different ethos. If you go to the southern U.S., you will get a different ethos than if you go to the northeast U.S., or if you cross the border into the Maritimes, or into southern Ontario, or if you go to Alberta or to the West Coast. Evangelicals may agree with the same things that we'll talk about in a moment in terms of convictions, but there's still a different spirit, different ethos, different kind of cultural engagement that is shaped by various regions, various national identities, and so on and so forth. So those are some opening comments, kind of more what it's not. But what is it? Well, what is evangelicalism? So if you look at that single sheet now, I'm going to give you the official definition of David Bebbington, and it's generally conceded that this is the standard definition. Anyone who's trying to define evangelicalism has to reference David Bebbington. It's basically the standard definition now. Now, David Bebbington is not a theologian, he's a church historian, but he would not say he's the spokesperson for evangelicalism. But this definition that you have before you, this fourfold definition, is basically recognized as probably the best that we have, and I agree. Look at the two quotes at the top of the handout for some context, first of all. The decade beginning in 1734 witnessed in the English-speaking world a more important development than any other before or after in the history of Protestant Christianity, the emergence of the movement that became evangelicalism. This is David Bebbington. The next quote, evangelical religion is a popular Protestant movement that has existed in Britain since the 1730s. It is not to be equated with any single Christian denomination, for it influenced the existing churches through the 18th century and generated many more in subsequent years. And so those are just some opening comments. 18th century England is the birth of evangelicalism. Now the term evangelical is used in different ways. If you're on the continent in the 16th century, evangelical meant Lutheran, evangelical meant Reformed, evangelical meant any kind of Protestant who wasn't Catholic. Anyone who emphasized preaching the gospel on the continent would have been called an evangelical. That's not how the term is generally used in North America when we talk about evangelical. When we talk about evangelicals, usually in the Western world, and when I'm talking about evangelical here, I'm talking about a movement born in the 18th century in England by a number of leaders that we'll talk about in a moment, that is a reaction to something that's going on in England. And the reaction is to what they consider to be cold, dry, dead orthodoxy. They consider it to be a church that has the Church of the Land, of course, is the Anglican Church. It's established by law, and there are restrictions on the freedoms and opportunities of those who are not Anglican. So it's the established Church of the Land, and you have a number of leaders John Wesley, Charles Wesley, George Whitefield, talk about them in a moment, who are concerned for the state of the church. And they're saying, you people think that you're Christians because you've been baptized into the church, you know the creeds, you think you're Christians, but you're not. John Wesley had an expression, almost Christian. He said, you're almost Christians, but what haven't you done? What you haven't done is repented and believed in Jesus Christ. And so the mission of these early preachers, John Wesley, Charles Wesley, George Whitefield, was to really stir up the church that is filled with people that just, they think they're Christians. Why? Because they're English. And they've been baptized as an infant. And hey, I know my creeds. And so they think they're Christians, but Wesley says, no, you're almost Christians. And so at the heart of the movement is this emphasis. You can see the characteristics of evangelicalism. At the heart of the movement is a reliance on the Bible. The Bible is ultimate religious authority, so they're Protestants like those who came before them. Conversionism, it's a stress on the new birth. Why are they stressing this so much? Because they're convinced, and I think they're right, they're convinced that most people in the land, or many people in the land, were convinced they were Christians. And John Wesley's, no, you're almost Christians. And so this is a revival movement. It's a movement that is seeking to stir up the hearts of those to make this faith that is almost there become real. And so this gets to the importance of the date. I know when I became serious about my faith. I know when I became a Christian. October 15th, 1984, 47 Brunswick Street, Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, around 11 o'clock at night. I know my moment. I know my moment. And if I asked you for your moment, many of you would be able to say, I know when I became a Christian too. And this is very important for evangelicals in the early movement. Why? Because people in the pews just assume they were Christians because someone baptized them when they were an infant. And they say, that's not good enough. You need to know when you turn your life over to Jesus. You need to know when you committed your life to Christ. And so they would have altar calls and all kinds of things to move from this cultural Christianity to become something real, vital, vibrant, living. And so that's one of the key characteristics of evangelicalism. Activism, but it's not good enough to just make a profession of faith. You must live it. And so evangelicals are active in their faith in so many ways. And then crucicentrism, the focus on Christ's redeeming work, is the heart of essential Christianity. Good works, moral living, obeying the Ten Commandments, those things are all good. But not one of those things will save you. It's the centrality of the work of Christ. And so it's not just preaching, get active in your faith. It's one, repent, turn to Jesus, follow him in obedience, and recognize that all of what you do and all of what you accomplish is in his power and because of the work of the cross. And so you package those all together. Put those, like I've pulled them, Bevington's pulled them apart into 4. Put them all together into a package. That's evangelicalism. That's the heartbeat of evangelicalism. And you say, well, Gord, what about infant baptism? They would say, well, you know what, that's important. It's something to consider, but what we're really getting at is moving you from almost Christian to Christian. Well, what about church government? Congregational, Presbyterian, Episcopal? Well, that's important to talk about, but the important thing is move from almost Christian to Christian. Well, what about Calvinism or Arminianism? What about God's sovereignty and providence? How does that work out? Well, those things are worthy of talking about, but move you from almost Christian to Christian. That's the heartbeat of the movement. It's an attempt to rattle and shake people in the pews to get them to move to a position away from sort of this cultural thing to living in vibrant faith. And so, next slide. And so it's a time of religious renewal and rebirth. And you've got pietism on the upper right. What's taking place in Lutheranism is a similar kind of revival movement. And then you have the Methodist revivals with John and Charles Wesley and George Whitefield. So you have these revivals happening in the 1700s as well. But then you'll also have the First Great Awakening. You can see over here in North America. And that's more revivals. And then you've got also revivals, the Henry Alline revivals in Canada. These are all in the 18th century. And these are all in the English-speaking world. And in the mind of these evangelicals, God is at work. He's stirring up his church to bring about renewal, to bring about revival. And they see this as this transatlantic movement. Those lines going across represent, the lower line is John Wesley. He travels across once to preach and do missionary work. It's a horrible failure. But George Whitefield goes 7 times across the Atlantic in a boat, back and forth. And he's a rock star. They estimate that almost every single person in the 13 colonies heard George Whitefield preach. Like he's larger than life. And so think of sort of popular rock stars today and how culturally everyone knows them. That's George Whitefield in the Americas. And so let's skip over these German pietists. Let's go to the next slide. Skip over. Key figure, John Wesley, father of evangelicalism. He's a Methodist priest. He's an ordained Methodist priest, but he's concerned for his church of almost Christians. And so he's the key figure. Many will coin him the father of evangelicalism. And so if you can ever read a biography on John Wesley, certainly do so. You will certainly be inspired. And his life is spent on a horse, traveling. I think he travels close to 500,000 miles in the course of his life. And if you look at it on your handout at the bottom, John Wesley. This is from his journal. This being my birthday, the first day of my 72nd year. So he's 72, and now he's reflecting on his life. I was considering how it is that I find just the same strength as I did 30 years ago. So why at 72 am I just as strong as I was at 42? The grand cause is the good pleasure of God, who does whatever pleases him. The chief means are, 1, my constantly rising at 4 for about 50 years. My generally preaching at 5 in the morning, one of the most healthy exercises in the world. And 3, my never traveling less by sea or land than 4,500 miles in a year. So there you go. You're thinking, well, how can I, and now remember that's on horseback, or walking. So you think, well, how can, if you want to turn 72 and feel like you're 42, this is the key. Get up at 4, preach at 5, and do that. Repeat every day, decade after decade. And so when we talk about one of the characteristics of evangelicalism being activism, John Wesley models what he expects his followers. This is the price of leadership. Methodists will come up with what's called the worn-out ministers fund. His ministers are expected to work 80 to 90 hours a week. Right? You give everything. You give all. Right? And so taking notes on that one, Matt? 80 to 90 hours a week. Now the problem, this is when we talk about DNA, one of the things we want to be careful about our DNA is evangelicals can follow the example of John Wesley so much so that they have the same end result as John Wesley. He had a horrible marriage. Right? His marriage broke up. So did George Whitefield's. And so they were so driven to serve God that they neglected their own family, their own relationships. So that's the sadder part of that strong calling, that they lose a sense of other responsibilities. But John Wesley, he's a giant. Keep going. This is just a picture of him preaching outdoors. His preaching, if you go back, he's denied preaching in some church buildings because the laws of the land are you can't just go willy-nilly and preach anywhere. You need the approval of the local priest or the approval of the bishop. And so he's denied in some parishes. And so he just goes out and he stands. There's one account. He goes out and stands. His father was an Anglican priest as well. He stood on the grave of his father and preached to the crowd. And the crowds sometimes are 10, 15, 20, 30,000 people. And he coins this phrase, all the world is my parish. In other words, I'm not going to be limited by your restrictions. I'm not going to be limited by your rules. I'm just going to preach the gospel. Now, he remains an Anglican priest till the day he dies. But he's got this mission. He's on a mission, as are his followers. And if we keep going, we'll skip this slide. We'll skip his theology. We can talk about that later. Charles Wesley is his brother. Charles Wesley is also an Anglican priest, and he's an avid hymn writer. He writes over 5,000 hymns over the course of his ministry. John Wesley preaches and writes hymns. Charles Wesley writes hymns and preaches, but they both have a different emphasis. And some Sundays, I always look at when we're singing hymns, we sing Charles Wesley hymns here. And so, but he's another giant figure. Keep going. George Whitefield, he's this great preacher. He actually starts the whole outdoor preaching movement. John Wesley thought it would be sinful to preach from anywhere outside of this pulpit. And George Whitefield basically says, no, go outside, look what happens. And of course, as soon as you get outside of a building, you can preach not just to 200, now you can preach to 20,000. And so, and George Whitefield, obviously, points to the scriptures and says, Jesus kind of preached outside, right? And so, Sermon on the Mount, let's just follow the example of Jesus. And John was quickly won over to it. So these are some key figures. Jonathan Edwards, he's not a Methodist. He's a Congregationalist over in the Americas, but he's a giant, theological giant, and he's a great supporter of the revivals as well. So those are some figures, if you're kind of wanting to place these figures that you may have heard of. These are the founding fathers, so to speak, and there are many women as well. I just don't have time to go into the role of women in the movement. But these are sort of the theological giants, the clergy that led the way. And it's good to just be able to place them in terms of who they are. Let's go to the next slide. And Henry Alline is in a Canadian version of George Whitefield, up Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and he's near the end of the 18th century. I went to Acadia Divinity College, did my Master of Divinity in Wolfville, and there's a picture of him, big picture on the wall. If you're a Maritime Baptist, you know of Henry Alline because he helped grow the evangelical movement in the Maritimes. But we need to keep going. And so let's move to the next slide. Evangelicals, where are they going? There are many issues, and so now I'm on this stapled piece of paper. Many issues that evangelicals face. And I know I'm just flying through material, so I apologize for that. It's just so much stuff to go through. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes left before questions. If you're looking at the handout, some of the issues. We could talk about issues in the global church, because evangelicals started in the English-speaking world. It was a movement among Methodists, and then it kept growing and growing and growing. Eventually it grew now to a movement of 600 to 800 million globally. And so you've got global Pentecostalism that fits within the rubric of evangelicals, but you also have other evangelicals. It's a movement that is exploding in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and so we could talk about the issues that evangelicals face in the global church and just recognize that there has been a movement out of the English-speaking world, and that took place over a number of generations. Persecution, evangelical Catholic tensions, evangelical Orthodox tensions. It's phenomenal growth, which is a great thing, but that also creates things you have to deal with, relationship with other religions, cultural engagement, relationship with churches in the West. Those are just some things that Christians, evangelicals, have to address. But in the West, there are issues for evangelicals in the West. New, no, or loss of religion. In other words, who cares about God in the West? There's this whole sort of move away from Christian identity within the West and Christian, just church attendance, church figures, what you check off on a census, what you say when you're asked, what your religious convictions are, so on and so forth. This whole growing group of those who call themselves nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not nuns as in nuns of a religious order. But who cares about God? Reconciliation with indigenous peoples, history and healing, move to the margins. What happened to our power? At one time, evangelicals were pretty central to Canadian culture and American culture, but no longer. Right, so what happened? Where's our power? Who cares about denominational distinctives? Post-denominationalism, women in ministry, to pastor or not to pastor? Evangelicals are facing that. Human sexuality, issues of singleness. The emphasis on singleness among some is new for evangelicals, but some are saying, can singleness be a legitimate calling for Christians? And in the past, the ideal was no, you got to be married, you have to be married. But there's a move towards, saying, well, yes, you can be single too, and that singleness is a calling. And of course, the issue of same-sex marriages, which of course in our church we've talked about, and virtually every church is talked about. And how do evangelicals respond to that? Religious pluralism, Jesus only. Now we're a country of many faiths. Well, how does Christianity fit in with that? Is Jesus the only way, or is he a way? That's a huge difference. What is too far in terms of technology? In terms of not just technology in what we do on a Sunday morning, but technology in terms of medical advances. Is everything fair game, or are there some boundaries that we will not cross? when it comes to bioethics or this or that, those kinds of things. Environment. Does the world even matter to us? Jesus is coming again. Who cares if the world's going to end? In fact, the world's going to end when Jesus comes, so let's just use it and do whatever we want with it. Or does the environment matter? Does this earth matter? And evangelicals have been deeply divided on that. And who is in and who is out? What do we do when we deal with divisions? Evangelicals differ on some things, in sort of that who's in, who's out kind of debate can be problematic. And so issues I've just listed for you, and those are, you can ask some questions related to those things. And so those are some issues. Identity is the next point. There are some questions around identity, and when we talk about where evangelicals going, yes, there's a host of issues. Now, those issues that I just listed, Christians of all denominations are facing those, but what is it about evangelicalism that shapes how evangelicals deal with those issues? Is what, I'm an evangelical. What I would say, there are certain things that come to bear when I address those kinds of issues. But what about identity? And a number of things, and I've just listed three. Fundamentalism, politics, and evangelical Catholic relations come to mind when I think about issues of identity. And there have been a number of movements related to these three areas of identity. Fundamentalism, of course, is a particular movement that arose in the early 20th century as a reaction to German higher criticism, moving away from a view of inspiration, authority of Scripture, those kinds of things, the rise of Darwinism. So there are a number of different factors that led to the rise of fundamentalism that was a movement to defend the fundamentals in a way that in some ways was successful and needed, but in other ways damaging because of the harsh polemics and division that occurred. And so issues of identity are still there for evangelicals. How can one defend the gospel without moving into some of the errors of meanness and harshness and division that marked the rise of fundamentalism? And I give you a book there, 4 views on the spectrum of evangelicalism, of sort of how different evangelicals identify within that spectrum, of how they'd answer that question. Politics. How do evangelicals engage politics? Do we engage? And the issue, of course, the most recent issue is the election of Trump, and 81% of evangelicals identifying as supporting Trump. And so what do you do with that? How do evangelicals engage politics? Now you say, well, Gord, that's an American example, and they're crazy down there. That's not us. Up in Canada, we're different from Americans. And so we pride ourselves on being very different in Canada. We have a sense of our own sense of uniqueness and superiority. But do we engage politics in the right way here? How do evangelicals engage politics in Canada? Well, it's a different way of engaging politics. We still do, but there's subtle differences between evangelicals in Canada and evangelicals in the state, and how we engage politics. But some of the recent polarization and rhetoric and stuff being said in the States just makes me very leery of actually identifying as an evangelical. Actually, if someone comes up to me in the street and asks me if I'm an evangelical, I will not say yes until I know where the person's coming from, until I hear what they think an evangelical is. Because if somebody says, "Are you an evangelical?" I'm like, what am I agreeing to if I say yes? Because in their mind, they may think that I'm a Trump-loving, gun-loving, mean-spirited, list all the different adjectives that you get from the media. They think that that's what I am. I'm like, well, no, I don't want to fit into your little box that you've put me in. So if somebody says, "Are you an evangelical?" first thing I'll say is, "What do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean by that expression?" Right? Because I'm happy to identify as a Christian, and here in a safe place, I'll identify as an evangelical. But boy, some people, if you identify as an evangelical, you may as well say you're also a Nazi, and you got a poster up of Trump and Hitler on your wall in your room, right? And so So again, I think it's a term that can be used, but it's this political aspect related to identity that creates problems for evangelicals. Even if we can say, well, that's Americans, we're Canadians, but the media isn't all that discerning. You may have noticed that. And so they tend to just slander and smear and fudge, and all you need are 2 or 3 over here to do something that's inappropriate, and then every single evangelical is painted with that, right? And so we've got to be very careful. But it's this political aspect of identity. How do we engage politically? I think we do engage politically. The question is, how do we do it in a way that is representative of what we believe and true to our history? And finally, Catholic evangelical relations, an end to enmity. I give you a couple sources there. Evangelicals and Catholics Together. It's just a statement by an evangelical and a Catholic seeking to find common ground for mission. And then Mark Knoll and Carolyn Nystrom just looking at how evangelicals have adjusted since Vatican II Council in the 1960s and asking, is the Reformation over? So some issues, lots of issues, and then matters revolving around identity. And then finally, what about the future? Well, if I knew the future, boy, I'd be very wealthy if I knew the future. Just a few things. Excuse me. I think a few things to consider as we look to the future as evangelicals. And now I'm speaking as an evangelical here, and I look to my own movement. This is a movement that I feel compelled to help resuscitate, motivate, inspire, be faithful to its past, those kinds of things. So I'm speaking as someone within the movement. But because I appreciate the movement so much, I feel that I need to be critical in a few opening points. I think evangelicals need to abandon some of our history when it relates to a lack of the mind. There's an anti-intellectual, anti-education streak within evangelicalism. We need to avoid that. We need to abandon mean-spirited fundamentalism that has so hurt the movement and the witness of the gospel. And we need to abandon animosity to Catholics and others. I'm not saying we need to say, well, we all believe the same thing. I'm saying there's a shift in how we view other Christians, and how we view others, and how we view the life of the mind, that I think we need to abandon some of the worst aspects of our history that way. It's like when you find out your family tree and you find out that really odd uncle or that really strange aunt, and you're like, I wish they weren't part of my family tree. Well, there are parts in our family tree that I go, well, they're part of my family tree. I don't want to perpetuate those sins, though. I don't want to perpetuate those things that are not helpful. But there's lots to live up to, and so I'm not just a critic lobbing bombs at a movement. I'm part of that movement. I want to learn from the past, avoid some of our history or abandon some of that history, but live up to being faithful to the ancient faith. Evangelicals from the 18th century were trying to live faithful to the gospel and to be faithful to this ancient faith that John Wesley, Charles Wesley, George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, Henry Alline, and others were preaching. Live up to our history, revivalism, and hope. Hope, I mean, we think today church attendance is bad. Church attendance was as bad or worse in the early 19th century in frontier America. 2 or 3 generations later, it was the Bible Belt. Why? Evangelism, revivalism, and they believed that God would pour His Spirit out and bring revival. And at the heart of our problem here in the West is that we need revival. We need God to stir people's hearts and to open their hearts to repentance and faith and trust in Christ. And we need to pray that, and we need to believe that, because that's our history. And that's also biblical, but I'm trying to draw on our tradition. That's what these Wesleys believed. They didn't stand there to try and preach that people would move from almost Christian to Christian and not believe that God would work. They believed that God would work and pour His Spirit out to bring that about. And we need to live up to that history. We need to be innovators. Early evangelicals were innovators. We need to partnership across denominations. We need to say, you're Methodist and you're preaching the gospel? Well, how can we help? You're Pentecostal, you're what? Congregational, you're Presbyterian. If you're preaching the gospel and you are one of us, then let's just do it. Yeah, you baptize infants, we don't, but hey, let's agree to disagree on that, and let's seek to move people from not Christian to Christian or from almost Christian to Christian. Meaningful engagement with society. Every single Victorian social reform movement was motivated by evangelicals in the 19th century. You think of prison reform, labor reform, education reform, every aspect of reform, social reform. At the heart were evangelicals. Meaningful engagement. And then find some heroes. To live up to our history means to know our history. We can't even live up to our history if we don't know it. So we need to read about it. We need to find some men, find some women who are heroic figures and say, I want to be like that person. I want to be like that person. And to strive to be like them. And because I think that's a way forward for us. We'll find great inspiration from them and examples. So, and then the little box, I'll close with this little box. It's written about the Wesleyan quadrilateral in Wesley. But it's a reflection on looking at Wesley and people saying, well, what can we find in Wesley? Neither the Wesley theology nor his methods are simple panaceas. Panacea means just a solution for everything. They're not like TV dinners that can be reheated and served up quickly for immediate use. They call for imaginative updating in the new world cultural context. Wesley's vision of Christian existence has to be reconceived and transvalued so that it can be as relevant in the experience of the late 20th century as it was to alienated English men and women in 1740. His point is very simple. The goal is not to go back to the 1700s and recreate 1700s in ministry. The goal is to somehow take the heartbeat of that, the motivation for what took place in those evangelical revivals, the beliefs, the convictions, the ethos, the innovation, all that, and say, well, what would that look like in the 21st century? And then bring that about, make that living and vibrant today. And I think that's a way forward for us. I'm not charting the future, but I'm charting things that will help us as we move into the future. And so that was a bit of a whirlwind tour of dealing with those two questions. And I know I haven't done it justice, but they're, who are they? I think now you get a glimpse of who they are and where they're going, some of the issues that they have to deal with. And so I'll take some questions now.